I was lucky enough to go to a 4-year teaching college, SUNY Cortland. They taught us, for instance, that the most important thing we could teach as teachers was critical thinking, and that the most important aspect of critical thinking was the ability not to answer questions, but to ask probing questions. They brought in examples of ways in which teachers could engage students. For instance, telling us the story of a geometry teacher who brought his students to a basketball court to teach the basic concepts of geometry. Vanessa Johnson is a griot, a storyteller and teacher. This is her description of how stories can enter into the classroom.
You can tell people the facts of a history. And you can even, often what I see, you can have them read a fictional book. But what I do is to take real documents and make them into stories. I bring that person, that enslaved person, that fugitive into the room. And I don't tell you just the facts of the story. I tell you what that person was feeling. You know, the story from a newspaper article of a run through Syracuse of Catherine and her baby and her jumping into a canal, the Erie Canal. They were on a boat. They were told that the master knew where they were. When they got to Syracuse, they were going to be given over, and they jumped the boat somewhere past Chittenango area or something. And her baby drowned and she lived. Okay, so those are the facts of the story. But the story is, I ran. Because see, when my baby was born and he was put in my arms, and he belonged to me for one moment and not that master, I promised him he was going to be free. That's the story that all of us can connect to, is that woman and her baby and her wishes for that child's freedom and this commitment that she made to that child, even to death, that she would not allow that child to be born and raised in slavery.
My first teaching job after I graduated from college was in a small, semi-rural, semi-suburban school. The principal, when he hired me, told me that the class I was going to have were students that had been pulled out of other classes because they were presenting behavior problems in those classes. I remember well sitting down in the first day at the desk in front of an array of students. There was only about 15 in the class, and they were kind of noisy but kind of getting into shape, and I just waited. And then I said, these rows won't do, let's get in a circle. That really took them back. And so we sat in a circle, and they told me, because I asked, what had happened to the two teachers prior. As it turned out, what they had done to the two teachers prior and what they were planning on doing to me. It had something to do with my car. I asked them what was important to them, which they found really disorienting. But after a while, they got into the swing of it, and they started talking about things that were important to them. In their case, it was a question of why drugs were illegal, and particularly marijuana, and how come they couldn't vote when decisions of government affected them, and how come school was just so awful. We talked for a while and figured out together that something that I had experienced in my youth might be something we could do together, which was to have a mock Congress. The students researched the issues that were important to them and developed bills and learned how to write briefs for and against their own bills and the bills of other people. They formed political parties. They haggled about voting for you if you vote for me, etc. They replicated all of the normal political processes of a democracy. And along the way, they did research on all of these various topics. And we figured out together how that could be applied to literally every one of the subject matter that they were expected to learn. Some years later, I worked with a teacher named Ed Blasland, who taught business math in good part by working with a local credit union to create a branch of the credit union in the school. And he connected the business math that he was teaching to that. Since he's become the vice principal of a local high school.
Kids are in the field taking pictures, coming back in class and analyzing what they take. And that's what we want. And it's like, well, wait a minute. How do you have time to do that with all this? Yes, because that ties to the curriculum. So it's my way of, I don't have to be standing up, lecturing to students, putting them to sleep, doing that. And how am I going to figure out giving them the experiential learning? No, the experiential learning is that way that I can get across the things I have to get across, the learning that they need to prepare for that test at the end. I can do it by experiential learning, getting them outside the classroom and doing it. Wonderful thing.
Over the course of my career, I've gone back and forth between teaching and community development, community organizing. Often at the same time, because I began to realize that involving young people of all ages, from elementary school all the way up to college, in community improvement, community development project was a great way of doing engaged education and doing community development at the same time. One of my first experiences of that began with helping form a community organization on the east side of Syracuse. There was a double empty lot in the middle of the neighborhood that I lived in and that we were working with others to organize. After we had the lots cleaned up, we were able to connect with faculty at SUNY ESF. There was an instructor, a professor named Cheryl Doble, who taught me that when there was a collaboration between a college and a community group, that was important to lay out the needs and interests of both groups, of the college and their students, and of the community group explicitly. I remember her coming to a community meeting and putting up a big T on the blackboard, and we would write what the interests were of the college course and the students, what the interests were in the community. And she said, and I found over the years that she was right, that creating those kinds of collaborations required that kind of explicit articulation and follow-up, or you might end up, and oftentimes this is what happens, with students perhaps learning what they need to, but the community not getting what it needs, or vice versa. Professor Doble's students asked us to get together a group of between 10 and 15 young people, 10 years old and younger, because that's who we had in mind as the primary users of the park. And we did that. And the students met us at the park, or at the double empty lot, and they brought a huge mound of clay and asked the youngsters what they would like to see in the park and to make those things out of clay. And so what ensued was a design project led by college students and 10-year-olds and younger that ended up producing the plans for the park. It included the stage, it included a bench, it included a sand box, and some other elements. And I'll never forget that one of the young people, who was a young man about 14 years old, worked really hard on making the bench a beautiful thing, and then put his initials underneath it, where only he and those who worked with him knew they were, but was a sign of his pride. Years later, I was teaching as an adjunct at Lemoyne College in Syracuse, and I was assigned to teach a social science research methods class, which I dreaded. What could be drier? What could be more uninteresting, less engaging? And so I racked my brains. How am I going to do this? I had developed a relationship with the school librarians and also with the community's library that was a public library about 5 blocks from the school. As it turned out, both people at the school library and at the public library had been for years wanting there to be more of a relationship between the two. And so I presented that to my students, and we figured out together how they could do a research project that was aimed at developing that collaboration. The only requirement that I had was that they use the whole range of social science research methods that they were supposed to be learning about. So there was qualitative inquiry, there was quantitative inquiry and analysis. They learned how to do interviews and focus groups. They learned how to do surveys. They learned how to figure out statistical measures like statistical significance. Once that was in place, that there was going to be a collaboration between these two libraries and that the students were going to help facilitate that by doing some research about what was needed and what was desired by people in the community, by people at the school, etc., everything else fell in place. And the students were able to learn the full range of social science research methods by doing them. And one of the things that I learned from that process, as a matter of fact, from every involvement I've had with engaged education, is that there is always a way. There is always a way. All you have to do is try to figure it out, ask questions, use the input of both community members and students, and be strong in your intention to teach in an engaged way. Over the years, I've realized that both individual projects and group projects, are at the heart of engaged education. There are reams, pages upon pages, written about what a project is. How do you know you got a good one? Listen to this elegant, very brief description by one of Vanessa Johnson's young students.
My purse.
That's a project?
I don't
What's
have
a project?
it. Yesterday you borrowed
What
somebody's
does that
needle.
mean? What does
Did
it
you give
mean
it
you're
back
working
to
on a
them?
project?
Did you give them back their needle or did you put it in your pen cushion?
It's like
You gave it back to them?
an
Who was it borrowed
object
from?
that you're working on.
So a project has to do with an
Was that-
object
was
that you're working on?
Mache?
Uh-huh.
I mean, not Mache.
And what ends up happening?
Huh?
Was who?
What ends up happening when you're working on a
Okay,
project?
I have some more needles.
You get done with it. And the best part is you can wear it, play with it, use it.